So today we're going to be hosting Ekdeep Singh Lubana. He's a research fellow at Harvard, and he's going to be presenting his paper, Rational Analysis of In-Context Learning Elicits a Loss Complexity Trade-Off. So before he starts, I'll give a quick introduction as to who he is. So Ekdeep is a research fellow in the Physics of Intelligence program at Harvard University's Center for Brain Science. His main interests, research areas of interest are AI alignment, the science of deep learning, and interpretability. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from IIT Roorkee in 2019. Since then, he's interned at various industry and academic labs, including Bell Labs in Cambridge and Qualcomm AI in Amsterdam. He completed his PhD at University of Michigan in 2024 and has published some really interesting papers that I highly recommend reading on learning dynamics and interpretability in NeurIPS, ICML, and iClear. So we're super excited to be hosting him and learning from a true superstar in the field. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Ekdeep to give an overview of what he'll be sharing today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Okay. Are the slides looking okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here. So what I'm going to present today is actually 3 papers and try to encompass them into like this broad sort of series of papers or agenda that we've been pursuing over the last few months on trying to understand a very specific phenomenon around in-context learning. So just to establish some common ground and a motivation. So in-context learning is this really cool behavior or capability that started to emerge around GPT-3 models. This was a figure from the GPT-3 paper from OpenAI by Brown et al., where what they show is that if you simply put a few exemplars exemplifying some behavior, some task, and just give a model a novel query following that task, a model can solve that by just in context inferring what the structure of the task is. This is often what you might think of as few-shot variant of in-context learning, or the few-shot formulation of in-context learning. There's also what you can think of as the belief update formulation of in-context learning, where I might have some prior over concepts that exist out there. And as in the context, I'm being offered novel ways that those concepts are being used, I can infer novel mappings for those concepts and start to produce in accordance with them. So the best example I like over here, or the example I find to be the best over here, is this example about learning in context this language called Kalamang from the Gemini team in the report on Gemini 1.5, where what they showed was if you simply feed in a grammar book for this language, which only has about 100 speakers in the world, and the dictionary for translation, you can find that a model, if you give it sentences to translate from English to Kalamang, it is pretty accurate at doing that. It's not perfect, but it is highly accurate. Okay, so this is in-context learning. Recently, we've been in this paradigm of scaling everything that exists out there. Any control variable about the learning pipeline we can find, we want to scale it. So people started scaling in-context learning. Basically, what you do now is, let's say in a few-shot in-context learning formulation, you take a task which you wanted to like see how well a model performs, and you just provided a few exemplars. And then, the model performs somewhat decently. So this is a state-of-the-art performance that existed from some benchmark and some method that was out there on a machine translation task. But then you just keep on adding more and more exemplars, and you see that actually the performance just keeps on rising up. So like you really beat state-of-the-art by just like talking more essentially to the model. And you can do this for other tasks as well. This is pretty cool because often people used to think of in-context learning as a mechanism or a capability that we have that models offer us so that we can elicit their behaviors and then hence evaluate them on concrete tasks. Now, the weird thing that happened, at least what I found to be a fascinating result, was this paper, Many-Shot Jailbreaking, that came out from Anthropic last year with Gemini and co, where what they show is that for certain behaviors, let's say over here, what they're plotting is a bunch of decently well fine-tuned, safety fine-tuned models, and they're evaluating whether they engage in harmful behaviors. Now, if you truly have a generally intelligent model, I'm not saying these are generally intelligent, but like assume that you had a generally intelligent model. If I just actually in context talked to it and gave it information about a new task, if it is truly intelligent, ideally it should just like figure out what that structure of the task is and just start performing in accordance with that. So even if you have a very well safety fine-tuned model, if in context, I just provided a bunch of exemplars about harmful behavior. So what I'm going to for now call harmful, so like violent or hateful speech, whether the model engages in violent or hateful speech, deception, and so on, you find that once you hit some critical context, before that, the model keeps on refusing the queries, but after that, it does start to engage in them. So this is the percentage of harmful responses. What are the given 100 queries, what are the odds that the model will engage in this harmful response? This is a cool measure, but like what I like to look at more so is this negative log likelihood measure, that how likely the model deems these undesirable behaviors. And what you find is there's this, so if you look at the Llama 2 results, you find this really fascinating phenomenon that occurs where to begin with, the model is deeming these responses to be not very likely. But then suddenly there's a transition of sorts. There's a point where there's a sudden break. There's more or less around the same point where where we were seeing that the models are starting to engage in these undesirable behaviors, and there's a bump, and the model starts to find these generations very, very likely, these behaviors very likely. So this specific bump, this specific kind of phenomenon is a bit of a challenge when it comes to something like evaluating model behaviors. Currently, well, if not necessarily anymore, but like at least until a few months ago, and still for smaller models, benchmarking them, we need them to be able to understand our instructions. And often one way that we get them to understand our instructions is by providing in-context exemplars of the behavior we want to evaluate them on. So to that end, like in-context learning is one of our standard tools that we use for eliciting model capabilities. But if you have these sudden bumps, if you have these sudden in-context learning curves, then there emerges an unreliability of using this tool for eliciting model capabilities. Because as it may so happen that you did not offer enough context, just enough context to elicit that capability. Perhaps you needed 32 exemplars, but you only provided 30 exemplars. And hence you did not see that the model was engaging in that behavior. But had you provided one more exemplar, the model would have done that. So what I want to do today is go through a series of papers that we've done driven by this question on understanding how these sudden learning curves are emerging in context. I'm going to call this a learning curve because essentially that's what's happening. You're providing data in context and the model is engaging or learning that behavior in context. Okay, so on that note, we will talk through these three papers. The first paper is going to be about creating an abstraction, creating possibly one of the most toy scenarios that we can think about with a very specific hypothesis that captures this phenomenon that we're talking about, the sudden learning in context learning curves. In the second paper, we'll talk about how to further simplify this task that we're working with in a simplified setting with toy models, such that we can provide a much more precise behavioral characterization. And in the third paper, we'll talk about a theoretical characterization where, as it so happens, we can not only explain all this phenomenology that we'll observe, but also create a highly predictive account where before even you train a transformer, I can tell you what kind of a solution the model will learn and how these in-context learning curves emerge in this scenario. Okay, so let's get started. The first paper, in-context learning of representations. These are my co-conspirators on the paper. It was a really fun collaboration with all these first three guys who were the co-first authors. Okay, so the hypothesis that we started off with here is that if you train a language model on some pre-training data, on some pre-trained corpus, there's a bunch of concepts that are involved in there, and the model will eventually learn some prior over these concepts. So something like, let's say, the word apple. Apple is, if I were to ask you what an apple is, you might think of the fruit or the company. But I could just start calling anything Apple and start using that as a novel referent for that concept, for some novel concept. So like when I'm doing that, you'll need some data. You'll need to like have certain observations which help you realize that, okay, we're talking about Apple with some novel semantics, and I need to update my prior to think about Apple in a different way. Let's see how a language model responds to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the simple grid over here, a simple grid graph, and associate to the nodes of this graph specific concepts that I'm pretty sure the model has seen during its pre-training. So apple, bird, milk, and so on. I'm going to do a random walk on this graph. So I go through apple, bird, milk, sand, and so on, and like just keep going through just some random walk. I'm going to then string this random walk into a sentence and feed it into a pre-trained language model. So it'll be a Llama 8B 3.1 model. I don't tell the model that there's a random walk happening on some grid structure. I literally just feed in apple, bird, milk, sand, and so on. And what you see is just this very simple task already starts to reproduce the phenomenon we were talking about before. There's a critical amount of context you need to reach, so a critical amount of length of the walk that you need to reach, such that before that, the model is basically behaving randomly. But then once you reach that critical context, once you reach that critical length of the walk, the model suddenly starts to make next token predictions, which are in accordance with this graph structure. So here, accuracy, it's defined as, let's say my walk were to end at opera. I'm going to look at the next token predictions of the valid neighbors, so egg, plain, and mango. I'm going to add up the probabilities and report that over here. So it's a pretty soft measure of performance. And it pretty clearly shows that depending on the size of the graph, there's a critical context. And this context is just increasing as you increase the complexity of the task or the structure of the graph. Okay, so seems like we're able to reproduce this phenomenon very simply using this the simple task of random walk on a grid. Now, what I started off with, the model might have some prior over these concepts, and hence possibly what's happening is that in context, it has to learn novel semantics about what it means to be an apple. In this task, an apple is just a node of a graph, and hence its representation, ideally, if the model understands the semantics of apple, its representation would be very similar to, let's say, the representation of bird, house, and milk, and less similar to, let's say, the representation of mango, which is also a fruit. So according to the pre-training prior, they may have similar representations, but according to this in-context task, they should not. So let's see if that's the case. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, as I'm going through this random walk, I'm going to compute the model's representations from layer 26 of the Llama model. So let's say my walk was of length 100. I look and it ends at apple. I compute the representation of apple at layer 26. And then I take some window behind it. So let's say a window of 20 tokens. And I pull out the representation for all these nodes that exist in that window. If they do not exist in that window, I might extend the window. But like basically all I want is I need to have at least one representation for each of these concepts. Once I have that, I just average out all the apple representations I get and just compute a 2D PCA of that. So I have the representation of apple, bird, car, egg, and so on. You get a matrix and do a 2D PCA. So I'm going to plot that 2D PCA over here. I'm also going to compute what we'll call a Dirichlet energy measure. So here, Aij is the ground truth adjacency of, A is the ground truth adjacency matrix, and Aij is reporting whether the ith node and the jth node are connected to each other. So let's say apple and bird, if we're talking about these two nodes, then Aij is 1. But if we're saying apple and car, then Aij is 0. And HIL and HJL, these are the representations we extract from layer L for node I and J. So ideally, if the model's representations for node I and J are very similar, then this whole product will be very low because there will be a similarity between the ground truth adjacency matrix and the Euclidean distances. So let's see if this actually works. So we're going through this walk and we're plotting both the energy and the PCAs on the right-hand side. And you see that when the energy hits its minimum, the PCA starts to exhibit the structure of the graph. So indeed, what we're finding is the model representations are changing in context. Like if for any cognitive scientists in the room, people often talk about this framework of conceptual role semantics, where the idea is that the semantics of a concept are inferred by the way it is, the role that it plays in some other set of concepts. So like here, apple is playing the role of a neighbor to concepts of bird, house, and milk. So ideally, the representation of apple should reflect that. And you see that apple is very similar over here. It is closest to the concepts of house, bird, milk. But like if we were to look at this at pre-training, so basically if I go back a slide, which I'm unable to apparently. Okay, apparently that does not work. Okay, yeah, that works. Yeah, so if we go back a slide, you can see that the representations of apple and mango are very similar to begin with. But then as we were going through the walk, the representations start to reflect the structure of the graph. And eventually we arrive at the point where apple and mango, so apple is over here, mango is flying around over here. They have, they respect the structure of the graph and have very dissimilar representations. And to emphasize this whole study, it's very similar to this whole line of literature that exists in neuroscience and cognitive science on cognitive maps, where you can actually do a similar experiment with humans, where you have some visual concepts and you're just doing a random walk. You're just flashing images to a human subject one by one and taking fMRI recordings of their brain as they're watching these images. And then you simply do a low dimensional visualization of their brain scans and find that you can extract out the graph structure that you use for performing this random walk from their brain scans themselves. You can easily think like how our task came to be. You can just do this with a language model where rather than showing it the model images, you're showing it words. So rather than showing an image of a banana, you say the word banana. So yeah, the aim here was in this first paper to show that even a very simple task can capture this notion of sudden learning in context. So the model has to, in context, infer a novel set of semantics about some concepts that it may have some existing prior over. Now, this is still a hypothesis. We are just seeing like we saw substantial evidence with like a real model on this task. But let's see if we can make it further more concrete. So to that end, what I'm going to argue is that if you think about this first task, this random walk task, this is basically just a Markovian random walk on some graph structure, right? So I could take this to heart and now intentionally design a model which is meant to perform random walks on some well-defined state space. So that's where the second paper, Algorithmic Phases of In-Context Learning, comes in. Again, my co-conspirators. It's a really fun collaboration, co-first authored with Krueger. Okay, so in this paper, what we're doing is, as I was saying, we have, I'm going to think about doing a Markovian walk on some state space. So I'm going to define n transition matrices, which have some prior over them. So during training, what happens is, I'm now going to train a model from scratch. Previously, we were not doing that. We were just taking a llama model off the shelf. Now we're training a model from scratch. So based on some prior, I just randomly sample a transition matrix. So let's say I sample the nth transition matrix. I sample a sequence from that transition matrix. And then I simply train a transformer model via next token prediction on it. So basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to simulate or learn a finite mixture of Markov chains. At inference time, what I can do is I can either take a transition matrix T star, which was sampled from this scene set of transition matrices, or I can just define a novel transition matrix. So I can do an in-distribution evaluation or a completely out-of-distribution evaluation. And here, what's going to happen is that, like, if you take this transition matrix, you just sample a bunch of sequences. So let's say the sequence ends at 2, and you compute the next token probabilities given this context that the model makes. So the predicted next token probabilities from the model. And you know the ground truth next token probabilities, which come from your T star. So what you can do is you can just like take a bunch of these sequences which end at different states, take a KL between them, and just average it out. So that gives you basically an estimate of whether the predicted next token probabilities, which can be thought of as like the predicted transition matrix, whether that matches the ground truth transition matrix. So this is going to be our evaluation measure. And now what we see is, just to give away the main result, the model is actually transitioning between a lot of very different kinds of behaviors. So here in this 3D phase diagram that we're plotting, each color corresponds to a different algorithmic strategy. So what I mean by an algorithmic strategy, which are, for now, they're listed out over here. I'll describe in detail what these are. But each strategy has a color associated with it, and it's algorithmic in the sense that I can procedurally write down in Python what these strategies are supposed to do. So like given a sequence, what a next token prediction according to this algorithmic strategy should be. And then I can compare that next token prediction with the model's next token predictions. And what you'll find is that like in these regions where this specific color dominates, the given strategy that almost perfectly explains the next token predictions that I write down in Python versus what my model makes. So each of these axes, which is the amount of training, so the number of training steps, On the z-axis, we have the data diversity, what I'm going to call data diversity, the number of Markov transition matrices that you see during training, and an inference time axis, which is how much context I offer the model to make its next token predictions. And what we were seeing before, which is that the model, as a function of context, was making transitions between its behavior. So it transitions from like performing one way to performing another way. For example, it was making random predictions, so it starts to make predictions according to the grid structure of the graph. Similar behaviors will emerge in this task, and that's via context. But in actuality, there's like even other axes which lead to like very algorithmic behaviors and transitions between. Okay. Also, just to mention, this task turns out to be very rich, despite its simplicity. Basically, all known results on in-context learning can be simulated in this task. So it's a very rich and fertile ground for studying in-context learning. Okay. So I've given a big spiel about what this phase diagram is. Let's see what these solutions in fact are. Okay. So if you think of a Markov chain, there are two characteristic statistics that define a Markov chain. It's unigram statistics, as in its stationary distribution, and it's bigram statistics, which is the transition matrix that was used to generate the chain in the first place. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to speculate some solutions that I can come up with based upon that. So let's say you have some transition matrix based upon which you sampled some sequence. Now what you do is you compute a histogram of the unique tokens that exist. So let's say if the state space is 10, then I compute the unigram distribution of each token in that sequence. Versus I compute the bigram statistics, which is the transition probabilities between two random states. And what I can do is once I have the in-context inferred unigram and bigram statistics, I can compare them with the ground truth stationary distribution, the ground truth unigram statistics, versus the ground truth transition matrices of the chains of the transition matrices that I see during training. So what I'm doing is I'm taking an in-context sequence and I'm comparing it with the generative process that generates the training data. So let's say if I take the histogram for a second, the in-context histogram, and I compare it with the stationary distributions of the transition matrices that are used to generate the training data, I can simply compute the distances between these and use that as kind of like a likelihood that how likely this specific transition matrix is to generate this sequence with the given specific set of unigram distribution. And then use that distance as a likelihood function. I have some prior over these, which I can assume my model has learned, and then use that to define essentially a Bayesian averaging solution. So you can compute a posterior probability and then use that to define a posterior predictive. That's essentially what we're going to do over here. So this first solution is what we'll call unigrams-based retrieval. So I have the unigram statistics of the sequence. I'm comparing them to the unigram statistics of my transition matrices seen during training. And whichever transition matrix I'm closest to, basically I do use that distance as a weighted average to perform weighted average and get a retrieval-based solution. So you're interpolating between the transition matrices seen during training based on unigram statistics, based on distance and unigram statistics. You can similarly do it based on bigram statistics. So that's what we'll call a bigram-based retrieval solution. Meanwhile, you can also have a situation, possibly, where the model has just truly learned the generative process of a Markov chain, which is that it understands that given a sequence, all I need to do is I need to infer the transition matrix and need to make next token probabilities according to that transition matrix. So I have no dependence on the training data anymore. I can genuinely simulate any Markov chain. And if that's the case, we'll call it a bigram-based inference approach, or just for now completeness, we'll call it unigram-based inference if it uses unigram statistics. This is possibly the weirdest solution, unigram-based inference. One might argue, why would a model make next token prediction according to unigrams? And we'll see there's a pretty good reason why it does that, and it will do that. Okay, so these are the four solutions that we had. So previously, what I was showing that 3D phase diagram, it corresponds to these four solutions. And what we can already speculate is that technically, bigram-based retrieval is the best thing you can do. It's the base optimal thing to do if you were to get as low an error possible on the training data. So in distribution, bigram-based retrieval will generalize really, really well. But outer distribution, it just cannot. It cannot go outer distribution. It can only interpolate between the transition matrices seen during training. Meanwhile, the bigram-based inference approach, which understands the generative process of Markov chains, it does not distinguish between in distribution and outer distribution, so it should generalize equally well. And similarly, you can make statements about the other, or make predictions about other solutions. So let's see if this comes to pass. So to check whether a model is using unigrams versus bigrams, we're going to define this test that we call bigram utilization. So here we build on the argument that technically, if you have a sequence and you just shuffle the sequence, the unigram statistics of that sequence remain the same because unigrams are order invariant. But the bigram statistics will completely be obliterated. So what I can do is I can just like offer a model a sequence, make next token prediction, shuffle the sequence, again make next token prediction, and just compute the KL between them. If the KL is 0, then what that means is the model only cares about unigram statistics. Versus if the KL is non-zero, then at the very least, the model is trying to capture statistics beyond unigrams. We'll see eventually that it is indeed capturing bigram statistics. Okay, so here's what the results look like for this test. On the x-axis, we have the amount of training. On the y-axis, we have the data diversity. What you see is that as a function of training, there's this like critical amount of training you need to reach where suddenly the model starts to use bigram statistics. Again, I'll clarify that it is indeed using bigram statistics, but like for now, it goes from unigrams to not unigram statistics, which will be bigram. And what's happening here is this vertical line. This corresponds to the model learning and induction. Now, if you need to compute bigram statistics, if you need to like make in-context perform in-context statistics computation, you just need an induction head. You need to be able to see which token comes after which token, which is the role of an induction head. So that's why this vertical line exists. There's a critical amount of training you need to go through. It's an optimization bottlenecked phenomenon, and hence, until you have reached this stage, the model will have to rely on unigram statistics. The second thing we'll do is we'll compute this experiment. We'll perform this experiment that we call proximity to retrieval. So I have the predicted transition matrix, the transition matrix that I predict after offering a model a bunch of sequences from some transition matrix. And then I can check whether the next token probabilities, they are for a novel transition matrix that the model never saw during training, whether it is close to a batch of seen transition matrices, so as the set of transition matrices that the model saw during training, versus a randomly defined set, a novel set of transition matrices that the model never saw during training. Now, if the distance between these two set of transition matrices is similar, then that means the model does not have a bias towards performing versus for performing in making next token predictions in accordance with the transition matrices that were seen. It can easily perform in accordance with. It is more or less performing in accordance with the unseen transition matrices as well. Meanwhile, if the distance was closer to the seen set of transition matrices, then what that would mean is the model has a bias towards performing in accordance with the seen set of transition matrices. So that's what we see over here in this test. As a function of training, if the data diversity is low, if the number of transition matrices you see during training are low, you see that the model has a preference towards performing a retrieval-like approach. So its distance to seen transition matrices of the predicted transition matrix is lower compared to an unseen batch of transition matrices. It doesn't exactly matter how this thing is computed, but like we rescale it to 0 to 1 so that we can easily see whether it's closer to retrieval or whether it's closer to inference. But yeah, as you increase data diversity, as you have too many transition matrices to memorize, you see that the model eventually starts to perform closer to an inference-based approach. It starts to have the ability to generate make a prediction according to a novel transition matrix eventually. So another thing worth emphasizing here is that if you look at any given set of transition matrices, so let's say something like 2 to the power 6, as a function of training, there is kind of like this frontier that exists. And this frontier, what's happening over here is that like eventually the model will still memorize, even though it starts off with a preference towards like performing like inference. Eventually, it will still memorize the relevant transition matrices and start to perform like a retrieval-based approach. So even though it may seem like if you just simply increase the data diversity, the model will perform like inference, maybe it's a capacity constraint or something. In actuality, what happens is that like the frontier does not exactly have an exhausting trend, like it's not saturating yet. So there's a possibility maybe this just keeps on going if you were to train further. And we'll see how this whole thing transpires in a few slides, but just want to flag this for now. Okay, so we have the bigrams test, statistics. We have the proximity to retrieval, which is saying whether the model is performing retrieval or inference. Now, what you can do is you can simply do a Cartesian product of this. The in-context statistics are your model, whether you have a reliance on training data versus not. And you get these 4 solutions that we were talking about. Uni-retrieval, bi-retrieval, uni-inference, bi-inference. These are still speculative. So we're saying that this is the region where the model will perform closest to bigram-based inference. This is the region where unigram-based inference approach will best explain model behavior, and so on. And when you actually programmatically write down these algorithms in Python, you see that indeed this is true. So here I'm reporting the KL between the next token predictions according to these algorithms versus the actual model that we train for a given amount of time/data diversity. And you see that indeed the next token predictions according to these algorithms versus a transformer is almost approaching 0. The KL is approximately approaching 0 in the regions that we speculated these algorithms to explain model behavior. So we have a pretty solid match between our predictions and what the model actually does. On that note, I quickly want to emphasize that often when you read papers about in-context learning, which try to explain how in-context learning works, I would argue that those papers are possibly confounded by which phase or which algorithmic behavior you're in. It's possible that early on we used to think in-context learning, let's say around 2022 or something, we used to think in-context learning is simply task retrieval. And that's indeed true if you, let's say, are trained too much or if your data diversity is too low. But if you just train on a very diverse data set for not necessarily the longest amount of time, let's say in an online fashion, you probably will get something like an inference-based approach, and hence your model's phenomenology, its behavior will be very different. So that might help us reconcile some of the existing results that are out there on in-context learning. Okay, so just to summarize what we did in this paper, we started off with this idea that model behavior is changing by scaling up context. Then we realized actually it's not just scaling up context, even scaling up the training parameters, the training variables is changing model behavior, often very suddenly. So we saw what these behaviors are. We defined algorithmically and procedurally what these behaviors are. We saw when these behaviors emerge. So specifically, what regions best explain the model behavior by these algorithms. In the papers, we also have how these algorithms are implemented. So let's say for bigram-based inference, you need an induction head. So that's where we have a characterization of how this very vertical line transition emerges. And in retrieval-based approach, we actually find that we can literally reconstruct the transition matrices from the weights of the MLPs in a transformer. So you can actually show the model has memorized the transition matrices for performing a retrieval-based approach. And we're not the first ones to be doing such a thing. We have arguably this rich phase diagram as we were the first ones to show it, but people in the past have taken similar tasks. So for example, there was this task on in-context linear regression, where you just offer the model some in-context offer a bunch of input-output queries. So some input vector, its linear regression mapping to some scalar, and have the model in-context infer a novel linear regression mapping. And what you see is that as a function of data diversity or as a function of training time, the model behavior changes. So here, DMMSE is one behavior. These authors, Alan and Thomas, are all defined versus ridge regression, which is kind of the base optimal thing you can do for performing linear regression. Similarly, there's another set of tasks called in-context classification that has been also very popular, and similar results have been shown on in-context classification as well. So all these papers, all of us are together coming along to show here is that depending on your training conditions and your inference conditions, broadly, depending on your experimental conditions, different algorithmic behaviors explain model behavior. Different algorithmic strategies explain model behavior. What is unclear is why this is happening in the first place. This is arguably the question we started off with. We started off with the fact that as you're scaling up the context, model behavior changes very drastically. And what we've shown at this point is that very simplified, very controlled setups can very nicely replicate that behavior. So going back to the question, why is this happening? Let's see if we can explain that. So this is where the third paper comes in. In-context learning strategies emerge rationally. This was a really fun collaboration with Daniel, Noah, and Gautam. Daniel is this young prodigy of a cognitive scientist. So if you're looking to recruit somebody, recruit him. Okay, so here, what we're going to do is we're going to take a step back and think about what were these tasks that we were characterizing in context learning on. Arguably, so if you think about the Markov chain task, I was saying we're trying to learn a finite mixture of Markov chains, a finite mixture of transition matrices with similar Markov chains. So you could do the same thing for the in-context linear regression task, for example, like where what people have done is they just have a bunch of linear regression tasks and you're just like trying to learn that finite mixture of linear regression tasks. So here, I would argue that like a general formalism starts to kind of like emerge, which is all in-context learning papers in the past, what we've been doing is we've been taking a bunch of tasks where I'm going to define a task as like some functional which takes in some parameters W. These parameters are sampled from some true data distribution. So there's some true prior over the parameter space. You sample a set of parameter vector from that and just feed it into some functional f of W to define a function. And this function is what we'll call a task. I define a prior over these individual functions, and we'll call this basically our training distribution, which is essentially like a distribution which has a discrete prior over these D functions. And when you sample from this training distribution, you sample first a function, and then you sample a sequence from that function, as shown over here. So as I was saying before, you can map on previously existing tasks, so linear regression and classification, which are relatively popularly studied tasks in this language. And you can also simplify. So in context linear regression and in context classification, people have shown that there's only two kinds of algorithmic strategies which explain model behavior. Just to have a coherent set of results with those papers, we're also going to simplify our Markov chain setting and call it now balls and urns. So basically what's happening in this setting is we have a mixture of urns or bins. This is kind of like a standard probability theory question, where you have some urn with a bunch of different types of balls in it. And I'm going to sample a ball one by one with replacement and show it to you. I get a sequence of these balls. As an observer, I get a sequence of these balls, and I have to predict on the next trial, when a next ball is sampled, what is the probability that that ball will be of a certain type. You can basically see that like the optimal thing to do here is just keep track of the frequency at which a ball is shown, ball is seen in context in that sequence that you've observed, and make a prediction according to that. So it's just a frequency computation or a unigram statistics computation task. Now, as you were saying, there's a general formalism here. So for all these tasks that we've seen in the past, you can think of them as just trying to learn a finite mixture of some tasks. So to begin with, what we did with the Markov chains paper, right? We simply speculated what are optimal solutions that a model might learn if it is trying to simulate these Markov chains. Let's see, therefore, what are optimal solutions you might learn if you're just simply trying to learn a finite mixture of tasks which themselves have a shared structure in the sense that they are the same functional whose parameters are sampled from some true distribution. So there's two distributions we're talking about, a tau train and a tau true. So what I would argue is that if you sample a sequence from a given function in this mixture of tasks, one optimal solution that exists, which will be the optimal for the training distribution, the tau train, is you define a posterior predictive over tau train. So you assume there's a discrete prior, that there's only these D tasks that I care about. And given that sequence, given the in-context sequence, I'm going to compute the likelihood that a given one of these tasks generated that sequence. Once I have the likelihood and I have some prior over these tasks, or discrete prior over these tasks, I simply do a product. And that tells me, that allows me to do a weighted average in accordance with the prior and the likelihood to compute next token probabilities according to the posterior probability, which will be just the product of the prior that I have on these tasks and the likelihood that one of these tasks generated the sequence. I'm going to call this a memorizing predictor. I call it a memorizing predictor because you need to know precisely what these tasks were. So you have a very specific reliance on your training data, the task you saw during training. Meanwhile, I'm going to also argue that technically, because of the shared structure, it is plausible that the model actually just suddenly starts to know what, starts to infer what the true data distribution here is, what the true generative process is. And in that case, the model will just have a prior which is continuous in nature. So it just has a prior that matches the true prior from which the parameters are sampled. It knows the generative process of the function itself and just given some in-context sequence, it just tries to see from the possible support of this distribution, which parameters best explain the in-context sequence. So we'll call this a generalizing predictor. This predictor can generalize to any novel sequence for any novel task. So there is no reliance on training data. You just actually have learned the generative process. What you can do is you can take these two predictors, these two general formulations, and show that for all the three tasks that we were talking about before, you can write down closed form solutions for them. So for example, for in-context linear regression, the two solutions that people have talked about before, what's called the DMMSE or the ridge regression solution, you can show that actually they are just specific instantiations of these two general predictors. So for example, ridge regression is just the optimal, base optimal general thing to do, given a novel task. And the memorizing predictor is if you just need to perform Bayes optimally on the training distribution. And we can do the same thing for other tasks as well. So we have this similar to the Markov chains paper where we had like speculated solutions. We have that now for these tasks. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply take my model, train it on these, take a transformer model, train it from scratch on these mixtures of tasks, and see what its next token predictions are. I'm going to look at the next token predictions I make using my algorithmically defined generalizing and memorizing predictors, and just compute a relative distance between them. So like, is the model closer to performing like the generalizing predictor, or is it closer to performing like the memorizing predictor? I'm going to add a half here so that so I'm going to rescale this so that it's between 0 and 1, but this current measure goes between -1 and 1. Okay, so this is what the results look like. As a function of training time and as a function of task diversity, you see that the model starts off with, for low diversity, to perform something like a memorizing predictor. So it has a pretty strong reliance on the training data. But as you keep on increasing the diversity, if the model just cannot memorize enough tasks fast enough, you see that the model starts to perform more like a generalizing predictor. So what I'm plotting here is the relative distance. And this is what the numbers look like, or the scale of the numbers. If you take any specific value of the diversity, so let's say 2 to the power 6 over here, and you just keep on training further, you see what we were seeing before in the Markov setting. There's kind of like what people call transients, where a model has the ability to begin with to generalize. It can perform very well outer distribution, but then it suddenly starts to have a reliance on the training data, and it can only perform well in distribution. And similarly, if you take only a given value of training steps, you see that as you keep on going above, if you keep on increasing task diversity, the model starts to have the tendency to behave like a generalizing predictor. On the marginals, we're reporting the absolute distances. So like, it's not just that the relative distance is going down, the model is truly starting to behave like the distance, absolute distance starts to go to 0 as a function of training or as a function of data diversity. Okay, so this was for balls and urns. For all three settings, you see this phenomenology starts to hold. The model is transitioning between these two behaviors as a function of the two controls we're talking about, task diversity and training steps. So what this shows us is that the model really just wants to perform well according to the two distributions that define the generative process, the training distribution or the true distribution, the generalizing predictor, the memorizing predictor, or the generalizing predictor. This, for cognitive scientists, is very provocative or evocative of the notion of rational analysis. Basically, if you have a learner who is just trying to perform optimally on the distribution that is offered to it, often John Anderson back in 1990 argued that like one way to explain the learner's behavior then is to assume that it is trying to perform optimally adapt to the data under its computational constraints. We're going to take this approach to see if we can like make a predictive account for what's happening. So as I was saying, the model is trying to learn these two predictors, generalizing predictor, which performs very well outer distribution, memorizing predictor, which performs very well in distribution. What I'm going to do now is I'll argue that Bayesian inferences tells us that if this is your hypothesis space, if these are the only two behaviors you'll ever perform like, what you can do is that as a function of observation, as a function of your training data, you can reweight these hypotheses optimally. So this is just a posterior predictive according to that. But now what rational analysis says is that we need to model the computational constraints. We need to model if I can, in fact, even implement these behaviors. So to that end, we're going to talk about two standard computational constraints that neural networks exhibit. Basically, what we want to do is we want to compute this posterior probability of some predictor F, given the training data. So one standard computational constraint that neural networks exhibit is scaling laws. the rate at which the loss reduces, the rate at which the evidence, or the rate at which I accumulate evidence or I absorb the data to make next event predictions, follows a power law scaling. Another is simplicity bias. Neural networks often have a bias towards learning simpler solutions first. So this form over here, this is simply saying the form of universal prior from algorithmic information theory, which is saying the model has a preference towards learning simpler solutions, where the simplicity or the complexity is defined as K of F, the Kolmogorov complexity of that predictor F. Now, Kolmogorov complexity is not actually something you can compute. So what we'll do is we'll literally just write down the Python files for the different predictors that we were talking about before and just run them through a compression algorithm. This sounds insane, but you'll see that this works. So the alpha, beta, gamma here are free parameters. We need to do some fitting for that, and that will be explained in a second. But yeah, so what we want to do is we have these two predictors. We're computing the posterior probabilities over them, and we want to compare which specific predictor the model behaves according to. So we have what we want to really compute is the log posterior odds, whether I prefer to perform like the memorizing predictor or the generalizing predictor. So this divides down into, this factors into the prior odds or the likelihood odds, like how well a given predictor explains the training data. And if you take those assumptions I was talking about before, do some math, it turns out you can write down this, you can write down a closed form for this, where basically the difference in the loss of the predictors and the difference in their complexity dictates which solution a model will learn. So let's see. So if you have that log posterior odds, you can turn it now into a predictor. So you can simply run it through a sigmoid, and that will give you the posterior probability of the first predictor, the memorizing predictor, versus 1 minus sigmoid, which will be the generalizing predictor's posterior probability. So this just now gives us what I was talking about before. In the Bayes optimal way of reweighting these hypotheses, we now have, if this theory holds, then we now have a closed form solution to how a trained model's behavior should look like. And that is indeed what happens. So here in this plot over here, we're showing the transformer's relative distance, so what we were plotting before. And you can see our equation over here, which is defined in a closed form way. And there is no reliance on any transformer parameters. Like none of this has any parameters in there. We find that we can actually perfectly predict the model behavior using just this equation itself. So we see these nice contours emerging in this setting itself, and the same holds for other settings too. We can use this equation to perfectly predict model behavior across a bunch of settings, as I was saying. So we titrate along possibly all hyperparameters that made sense to titrate along for the 3 settings we were working with. And in pretty much all settings, our equation continues to hold, and we are able to explain model behavior very well. I'll maybe skip the slide in the interest of time. But just to offer some intuition and wrap things up, what we were saying before is that models transition between different behaviors as a function of experimental conditions. So essentially, models, according to this equation, this functional form that we're talking about, what we're saying is that the models have a simplicity bias. They have a prior which prefers simpler solutions. When data diversity is low, you can just implement a generalizing predictor. You don't really have a big preference between generalizing or memorizing predictor. So you can just memorize the data. But as you keep on increasing the diversity, implementing the memorizing predictor will require learning or memorizing a lot more parameters. So you have a preference towards implementing the generalizing predictor. But as a function of training, you start to see that actually the memorizing predictor explains the data better. So it'll have a better loss. And a product of this is what gives you a phase diagram that looks like this, that as a function of diversity, you have a tendency to proclivity towards performing like a generalizing predictor, but as a function of training time, you have a proclivity towards performing like the memorizing predictor. And this is what we were seeing before. In the previous slide, we had the probabilities, but if you simply take a log, you should get an additive factor. So here we have the log prior odds that we empirically computed, the log base factor, the likelihoods. And if you simply do an addition of that, you should get a phase diagram that looks like this. And indeed, that is what we were observing before. The phase diagrams we were looking at before, they emerge out of a consequence of this. So what we're saying is that models, depending on how well a hypothesis explains the data versus the simplicity or the computational constraint, that like, can I even implement this from the get-go? Can I even implement this behavior from the get-go? Or do I need to like do a lot of learning to be able to implement that behavior? Leads to transitions where once I see there's a certain hypothesis which explains the data better, the likelihood overtakes the prior and has the model behave in accordance with a different algorithmic behavior. My co-author Daniel, in accordance with our pitch, made this cool ChatGPT image of William of Ockham holding a razor, because essentially what we're talking about is simplicity bias, i.e. Occam's razor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ekdeep. That was an awesome talk. I think we have like 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has like some really pressing questions to ask Ekdeep, please feel free. Okay, we have a question in the chat, it looks like. Q&A. Let's see if I can open that up. Sorry, would you mind posting your question in the chat? I'm just not seeing the Q&A anymore. Okay, so Angela asks, thank you for the talk. In the first section regarding in-context learning of representation, you showed that the model learned the graph by 2D PCA projection. So she's asking, in layer 26, how did you select this layer, and what was this consistent to all the layers?
Yep. Yeah, great question. So let's look at backup slides. So this is what the results look like across layers. What you see is that in the earlier layers, there's like a pre-training prior bias. So like the model's representations are very much like what we would expect according to the pre-training prior. But then as you keep on going through the different layers, as you keep on going deeper into the layers, the later layers behave in accordance with our graph structure. So layer 26 is over here. And if anything, it only gets better deeper. There's 32 layers, so eventually the unembedding layer will look very weird because it has to. But deeper layers show more so the in-context structure, and the earlier layers show more so the pre-training structure.
That's really cool. I want to ask also, do you think there's any overlap between your work and the physics of language models from, I believe it was Professor Zian Alan Zhu at Meta? So he has like a series of papers on like knowledge storage and diversity of training data. Do you see any overlap with that?
Yeah, this is kind of like a provocative question.
Yeah.
But so I think like, so our group is called the Physics of Intelligence group. So right in there, you see that there's a pretty strong similarity with thinking about things in a very similar way. I would argue that like physics as a topic, as a field, its motivation is to like build predictive accounts. So it's not just about explanations. It's to take phenomenon that like a system exhibits, a natural system exhibits, and then start off with like phenomenological theories. So essentially identify what control variables control the system's behavior, and then go further ahead and then develop mechanistic accounts which bottom up explain the behavior, how the behavior emerges in the first place. I think like from that point of view, what we have been trying to do, for example, the in-context learning of representations paper is the phenomenon. The algorithmic phases paper is trying to like create a phenomenological account. So create a predictive account. And then in the in-context learning strategy emerged rationally paper, we're trying to like actually perform a theoretical account, which has a phenomenological theory itself. But we don't have a mechanistic theory yet. So in that regard, I think like where I see the physics of language models paper, it's still in like maybe stage 1 or stage 2, but it's not exactly gotten into like a predictive account or predictive theory design yet. So it's cool, but I think maybe the physics word is overloaded a little bit.
Yeah, true. I had a query regarding one of the limitations that you have shown in the in-context learning, specifically with the Bayesian model stuff. So, like here, like one limitation that you use of the settings where the model behavior is largely explained by only the two predictors that you had. So like other works have identified 4 predictors to explain their task, like to produce the bigram versus unigram outputs. So yeah, what do you think? Like, can it be extended to that use case too?
Yep. Yeah, totally. So currently, the way we did the modeling, we just focused on computing log posterior odds. Like we're doing a model comparison kind of perspective, right? Like there are two predictors, and we're just computing like what has a higher posterior probability. But you can easily just like not do a comparison. So you just compute the absolute posterior probability in an unnormalized manner. So there's some partition function that will show up, and you just ignore the partition function for now. But when you have to compute the next token probabilities, you have to do a comparison anyway. So let's say there were 4 predictors, all of them will be over here in the denominator, and that partition function factor will just cancel out. So you can easily extend it to multiple predictors. And in fact, like we're currently working towards doing that just to demonstrate to people, because this question often comes up, that it's actually pretty easy to do that.
Yeah, true. And plus, like this work, this last paper specifically identifies ICL as a Bayesian, but I think so. Yeah, like under assumptions like that you made initially. So it's like behaving more or less like that. So like, can we like change the assumptions a bit to come up to like a different conclusion to the
so basically ICL is definitely Bayesian is what we are saying, but like Bayesian in what manner? Like the retrieval solutions I was talking about before, they are Bayesian solutions. They're Bayesian averaging predictors over here. This is unigram-based retrieval, bigram retrieval. It's just Bayesian averaging. But unigram inference, bigram inference are also Bayesian solutions. It's just like the prior you assume are different. So like Bayesian with respect to what? Like what is the distribution you're assuming? And then when we go into the second paper, what we're talking about is the computational constraints part, where when we talk about the computational constraints, we're saying, what is the prior? This prior dictates, like, even if these predictors explain the data very well, like, what do I prefer to implement? Given that both of them are going to perform pretty well, what is my preference between them? So this is why we actually in the paper, we said this is a hierarchical Bayesian model. These predictors themselves are Bayesian, but then we're also putting another Bayesian prior on top of that.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. Like this work like builds upon like top of many works that have previously come across. So you can like, I can specifically say, like, looking at this paper, it stands on the shoulders of giants, and specifically with the Markov processes that are involved in this and the previous papers as well that we have worked on. So like that kind of intuitive, so very good like explanation of what the work is currently representing. So yeah, kudos to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I see there was another set of questions. I can, if you guys want, I can respond to them now.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time if you have to go, but I think we have 2 last questions if you have time.
Yeah, sure. So Herschel asks, how would you say these results extrapolate to more real-world tasks like images, and how would you approach directly analyzing on complex data and tasks? Yeah, we're actively working on that. I'm personally pretty confident everything I'm saying holds on real settings. So for example, we started off with, if you recall, many-shot jailbreaking. That was the phenomenon we were trying to explain. And we designed a synthetic task, which captures that. Then we designed a synthetic toy model, which captures that. And then we designed a predictive theory, which provides us a precise intuition for how to explain the behavior. But now, if the theory is correct, we should be able to go back to the phenomenon we started off with, many-shot jailbreaking, and make some statement about it. So that's what we're working on right now. I currently believe we can actually like preemptively predict before you even run this experiment. I can tell you how many examples you will need for getting the model to behave, let's say, in accordance with like generate violent or hateful speech. So we're actually trying to create a predictive account of many-shot jailbreaking with a pre-trained language model now. The theory is exactly the same, what I was showing before. Just the thing that we need to do is we need to model the prior. We need to infer the prior. In cognitive science, is a proper, pretty common thing to do. inferring priors from data. So we're just like reappropriating those tools to see if we can make a predictive statement about this. We have some decent results already, so I am quite hopeful with where this is going. But also, we have a bunch of other work where we show a lot of these theories. If you like start off with these synthetic toy systems to capture some phenomenon and then like make predictive theories about that toy phenomenon, and then like just make predictions about the real data, whether that holds. And like generally, as of yet, we haven't had any negative cases. And to me, the reason for this is just like, you're just trying to learn the distribution. Your distribution can be a synthetic distribution or like some natural data distribution. As long as you learn the distribution, you can always make predictions about, if you know something about the generative process of distribution, you can always make some predictions about the natural data itself. And hence, as long as we have intuitions constructed using simplified scenarios, we can check whether the intuitions hold with real scenarios. So yeah. Then, I hope that answers the question. There was one more question, another question by Angela. Since our later layer model learns these patterns consistently, is it correct to say that if we edit these layers, then jailbreaking the model becomes easier? I guess not. What I would argue our results are showing is that the earlier layers have the pre-training prior, and like in the many-shot jailbreaking, you can think of it as that the model has a safety prior. It kind of like has a prior towards like not engaging in unsafe instructions because of safety fine-tuning. And most likely that prior is in the earlier layers, not so much in the later layers. Because in the later layers, you can just like in context manipulate the representations. So I would say that jailbreaking becomes easier if you intervene on the earlier layers, because you just like can reduce the prior probability over some behavior, over the behavior of like not engaging in unsafe tasks. That being said, earlier layers are the most difficult place to perform interventions, because if you intervene on earlier layers, that like has trickling effects on all downstream layers and hence all downstream behaviors. So if you do perform intervention on earlier layers and it doesn't work, it might be confounded by the fact that you might just be breaking the model itself. But yeah, great question. And I think not necessarily a clear answer is feasible until we do the experiments.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. So yeah, we'll let you go. I know we're over time, but really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this really cool series of papers with us. And we hope you can stay involved in the community. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of follow-up questions and will be following your work. So if you're not a part of the Discord, I can send you an invite for that as well.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
All right,
Thank you so much for having me again.
All right.
Thanks
Thanks, guys. Thank you, everybody, for
Yeah.
joining. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.